Hello, I'm Will Yeoman. I'm CEO of Writing WA, and welcome to another episode of Pod Street, Writing WA's official podcast. And again, we're coming to you not so much live, well, it's live right now while I'm recording, but from the wonderful Tom Collins house. And today it's my pleasure to introduce Rhuwina Griffiths, who is a life story writer. And we'll put ghostwriter in there too, because that's quite intriguing. Rhuwina, welcome to Pod Street.
Thank you very much, Will. A pleasure to be here.
Okay, look, we've got a lot to talk about, and I have to admit I got a sneak preview a couple of weeks ago when you dropped in to Tom Collins' house to say hello, and I was very much intrigued then, and so now I get to hear the backstory. What really intrigues me is how one gets into this particular area of writing, so perhaps you could take us back a bit, because you've been at it for, 25 plus years now? So.
Okay, well, a very long time. So there are two strands in my life, if you like. One is teaching and training, and the other is writing. And just to put everybody out of their misery straight away, I'm 69 years old. So for pretty much 50 years of my life, that's what I've been doing full time. But I haven't earned my living as a writer for all of that time. That came probably when I was in my late 30s. And I had what I call a very lucky break. I'd been teaching and training for quite a long time, and I really, really was keen to get out of it and do what I love doing, which is writing. And all of my life I have written from when I could first hold a pen and pencil in my hand. I remember listening to Richard Flanagan years and years ago, not long after I think he'd won a major prize, maybe it was the Booker Prize. And he was being asked, when did you start writing, Richard? And he said, well, when I was a little kid, my mum used to make these little books up for me. She'd staple a few little bits of paper together, and I'd have my pencil, and off I'd go. And he could have been describing me. That's actually what my mum used to do for me. I'd make these little books, and I'd write in them little stories. I'd line all my toys up on the bed, and I'd give them a little storybook. I mean, it's kind of sweet looking back now, isn't it? But anyway, moving on to my adult life, and I'm nearly 40. I am heavily pregnant, and I no longer wish to remain in teaching and lecturing and training, which was, it had been my meal ticket for a very long time. And I was looking on the back pages of the Times one day, and I saw a little advert for a Person Friday required by a busy publishing executive. And I was shortlisted for the job. I took myself up to London. It was quite a trip for me. I was about 6 months pregnant at the time with my first child. I didn't want the interviewing panel to realise I was so pregnant, and so I wore my coat and kept it tightly drawn over me. And it was a peculiar interview because Martin Johnson, who was the busy publishing executive, didn't really have a very clear idea about why he needed Person Friday, apart from the fact that he had too much work on his plate and somebody had to give him a hand. And the interview was very strange because every time he'd ask a question and I would pause and I'd think how to answer it, he would step in and answer it on my behalf. And at the end of the interview, I actually recall I went outside and I sat on the pavement and cried. I thought, this is just terrible. There's no way that I will have any work from this person. But indeed, my dreams, my prayers, whatever you want to call it, were answered, and I became his Person Friday. And it was a really good introduction to writing, because what I had to do, as well as research and editing, after he established the fact that I could actually write, he would give me commissions to write reports for him. And that's how I started. I was nearly 40, just had my first baby, probably not the optimum time, you might say, to become a professional writer. And for the next 15 years, I worked from that job. I had a small consultancy, then I set up a limited company with my husband. We were the writing network in the UK. We had a niche market, and all the writing that I did, and with my husband as well, it was largely research, writing reports for government departments and quangos. We had a major university as one of our clients. It was really technical stuff, so it wasn't what I would term creative writing at all. But towards the end of our time in the UK, my singing teacher, her husband, wanted to be a novelist, and he was a remarkable man. He'd been a GP all his life, and he was also a professional musician, and we just clicked. He was a great guy. And he persuaded me to come along to a little literary event in Porlock in Somerset. And although it was a tiny little literary event, it had some big names behind it. So Margaret, I think it was Margaret Drabble or Margaret Foster, one of those two, had been the guiding light. So Porlock, tiny little village and on the edge of a fairly remote part of Somerset. But because of her name, she managed to attract writers of calibre to the festival, including, I remember the first time I went, there was Boris Johnson's father, Stan Johnson, and the whole Johnson clan came to support Stanley. But anyway, when I went on this particular occasion, on the last day, there were 5 writers of different genres, and they were writers of calibre and substance, not the sort of people who would normally attend a very low-key little event like this. And they had all been invited to talk about who they were, how they'd become a particular type of writer, and I think possibly to inspire the audience that you too can become a thriller writer, or you can, in one particular instance, the lady who really engaged me was a lady called Hannah Renier from London, and Hannah wrote life stories. And I listened to her speaking and I was rapt. I could not wait until after the event to go and talk to her and say, Hannah, how did you do this? And she was very generous with her time and guidance. And that literally was the turning point for me, Will. A few years later, I found myself, I've been here in Australia now for nearly 12 years, and I thought, I do not want to be writing corporate reports until the day I die. I want to do something where I'm out there, meeting people, talking to them, and listening to their stories. And the more that I have done this, the more I've realised it is hugely important, I would say, for every human being to leave some record of who they are.
I mean, it's that old saying, the unexamined life, isn't it, is not worth living, or not. You haven't lived. And I read a quote from you somewhere saying that between your birth certificate and your death certificate, this is the story of your life. That's where it is, in the middle. But how important is it for people to realise that it's not about producing a book, it's not about being published, it's about setting your life down in words?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the first fallacy, and something that I'm very keen to shoot out of the water, is that when you go along to a library or a bookshop and you see, as you will, a wonderful collection of books featuring celebrity personnel, there might be anything from politicians to movie stars to singers to whatever. I would say that 99.9% of these books have all been written not by the person whose face is on the front cover, but by a ghostwriter. And I think one of the reasons that people become very dispirited is if you look at a book that's been professionally written by somebody who is paid to write it, and then you think, I would never, ever be able to produce something like that. And so in your head, you close the door very firmly and you say, no, I could never do that. But the other side of the coin, and this is where I would like everybody to start by just thinking this, could you write a letter to somebody that you love? And could in that letter you explain a little bit about who you are and the values that you've had and maybe the life that you've led? And I would highly recommend a book by a Canadian environmentalist called David Suzuki, who wrote a book called Letters to My Grandchildren. It was published in 2015. And in the book, David's written 6 letters to his 6 grandchildren, and he starts the book by saying, do you know, my grandparents were dead before I had a chance to ask them anything, and I would give anything to be able to put the clock back and to be able to sit down and have a conversation with them. And he said, that is why I'm writing this book, not to talk about my life so much, but to talk about some of the things that I think that the future generation would love to know about. They'd love to know about the state of the world that I live in. They'd love to know, how do I approach, I think he was probably in his mid-70s at the time, how do I approach aging and death? All of these things. And he's written letters on different topics of interest. There are probably about 15, 16 letters in the book. And if you were to ask me, which you haven't, because we haven't got time, but I'm going to say it anyway, what is my most prized possession? And they are 2 letters that were written to me by 2 people I loved very dearly. One was my father and one was my uncle. And they wrote me these letters before they died. And for many, many years after their death, the letters were so precious to me that and I know this will probably sound very, very silly, but I would carry them with me all the time. So when I'd leave the house, the letters would be in my handbag. I just wanted them with me because that's all I had left. The letters were tangible. The letters talked about the love. The letters talked about their life. It was just phenomenal. And then one day I had the horrible realization, what if somebody stole my handbag? And now I don't carry the letters with me all the time. But what I'm trying to say in a very long-winded way is you don't have to write a book. You don't have to write reams and reams and reams. Just sit down. You can write a letter. You can write an email. Everybody can do that. And from that little, maybe a couple of 100 words, you might find that you write another couple of 100 words. You might have another thought, another memory. And from those small beginnings, if you put everything together in little clusters, think about, a raspberry or a blackberry, they're made up of all these little segments of fruit. You take the whole one in your mouth and it's delightful. And so approach writing in that way. It's how I approach writing. It's how I approach life. You can never think about the big picture. All we have is today.
Yeah, look, no. I mean, you're absolutely right. And so many of us are so busy too. Does anyone have time to sit down for hours at a stretch to write? No, but they can snatch half an hour here or there and write those little, letters or excerpts or paragraphs, which are self-contained, but also part of a much bigger picture. I want to ask you next, because this presupposes 2 things. You teach live writing, but you also write life stories, ghostwriting for other people. So there are 2 different aspects of your craft. So, I'm guessing that people will come to you with a specific request, or you're teaching a workshop. Some people want you to do the work, but you also want to show others how to do the writing themselves. How do they work together?
Well, they work in tandem, and I will say, Will, that when I started, all I did was write books for other people.
Okay.
That was all I did. And I realised very quickly, because a book, as you know, takes a long time to write, and it could take me anything up to 18 months. It's a long time to spend with one person. And when I realised, which I very quickly did, how important it is for the recipient to receive that book of their life story, it suddenly dawned on me, why don't I have a go teaching it? And because my background is as a trainer, I approach my teaching in a very different way, I suspect, to most people. My first job, I was an education officer in the Air Force. And so my work was largely administrative and a little bit of training. And although I qualified as a teacher, I learned more about training and how really to impart knowledge and inspire people, actually, from a very short course that I did in the forces. And at the time, their training was based on an American model. It was called the functional approach to training. And what you do, you analyze every aspect of a job, you break it down into very small segments, and then you put it all back together. And the training that you deliver is in these little bite-sized chunks. And one of the reasons, maybe it's me personally, I don't know what, but I get very frustrated when I go along to a professional training event and people do not actually teach me. They, particularly with writing, sadly I have noticed that there tends to be perhaps a more creative approach to the craft. If I go along to an event, I want somebody to teach me. And I have exactly the same expectations when I have a group of students in my class. I never spend time asking them, spend the next hour, I'll give you a writing prompt, off you go. I'm there to teach. So I will teach them how do you write about people? How do you write about places? How do you incorporate detail, and which are the important details? We could talk about this again for a lot. So I'm there to provide instruction. And then the other thing I'm there to do is to help them realize that you have to analyze other writers. So if you want, in a very short time, if you have gone from a zero blank position, and most people have never done much writing in their life, maybe, they might have written a little bit if they were in a job that required a few little articles or reports or technical writing, but they will never have tackled anything like a life story before. Excuse me. So what you need to do is to give them the building blocks. This is what you do. Just follow this. It's a tried and tested method. And in tandem, while you are doing this, here are some writers and here are some extracts from their writing which show you very clearly how they have written about people and places and all the other things that I teach. And then you go away, pick a book, just analyze one chapter, maybe analyze a couple of pages, see what the writers do. And the thing that surprises most people when I ask them this question, what is the best-selling non-fiction book in Australia, the one that's been at the top of the charts for probably the last 6 years, nobody gets it, and it is Scott Pape's The Barefoot Investor. And how does Scott begin the book? With two wonderful stories, one about the alpacas and the other about how his farm was burnt down, and he goes back and he sees a sheep with its blackened feet. They are two really simple stories that anybody could write, and they are wonderful. I'm sure people buy the book because, in addition, to wanting to know a little bit about what do we do with our $5 every week to make it $50 at the end of the year, they love Scott's stories. They are so engaging. They're not difficult to do. All of my students, after they've been with me, I would say after they've done an introductory 5-week course, by the time they come back to do another 5-week course, they are writing like professionals. They don't believe me, but they are. Because in a short period of time, they suddenly realize, I can do this. So my job is show them, give them the tools, but the other really important ingredient is to inspire. Never look at the negatives with writing. Always look and see what people do well. And the more you can reinforce that, off they go.
I mean, it's interesting because I so often hear this, that it's not so much that people can't do something, it's just they simply don't know how. And once you show them, once you open that door, I mean, they're off, aren't they?
Totally. So one of my favourite ways, if somebody asks me to run a fairly short workshop, and in 2 or 3 hours I have to give them the package that maybe we would spend a lot longer on, I say, right, well, the package is quite simple. We'll take 10 photographs. And then we will do what all good journalists do, and we'll ask the 5 questions, the who, what, where, when, and why, and maybe how. And we'll look at the photograph. We'll do this together with a photograph, and then you can do it by yourself. And you will find, when you allow yourself to go into that photograph, you'll start to notice the clothes that you were wearing. You'll think, where did the clothes come from? You'll notice some of the other people who were there with you. Maybe it might be a parent. You look at your mum's hair and you think, I didn't realise she had brown curly hair, because I only remember her in latter life when her hair was grey and short. I'd totally forgotten all of these things. And it's a very simple, straightforward way to put together memories in an enjoyable way. And because, and this is also the big thing to consider, while you're writing primarily for yourself, you do hope that at some point somebody might read what you've written, and you have to be conscious that the younger generation, particularly if you have grandchildren, they're not going to be avid readers in the way that somebody of my generation would be. I would list my number one pastime as reading. Reading probably right in number 2. But young people today, no, they don't. They read in short chunks. I watch my children, and it's short amounts of information that they like. Nothing too in-depth usually. And if you can combine that with a picture, they're away. They will read your story. Whereas if you present them with a book with 80,000 words or 40,000 words or whatever it might be, a few little pictures interspersed, they'll say, thank you very much, but the chances are they're not going to read it until you're dead. Sorry, but it's true.
No, look, I understand. And it's interesting you talk about these short chunks because in the last few years there's been a lot of interest in the so-called flash fiction or microfiction, now micro-memoirs as well, where that is it. You're just providing a snapshot. And I imagine that would be quite popular because it really is that bite-sized chunk, but it's actually not a part of anything else. Well, not a part of anything else that someone's going to write. It just exists on its own.
Yes, I think, didn't you interview Night Parrot Press?
Correct. They are one of the excellent sort of promoters of this kind. That they specialise in this kind of form. Yes.
And I think one of my students, a doctor by the name of Bruce Powell, I think he entered their competition, and I think he won a little slot. Flash fiction is great, and I think it's great as a mechanism to allow you to think anecdotally within a very tight word limit. But I think it's very hard for people, dare I say, who are not experienced at writing, to condense in a short number of words something that others will find that interesting. It's really, really hard. When I read the Weekend Review magazine, on the last page, they have a short extract. It's called The Last Word, and anybody can send in up to 250 words. And I read that, and I think to myself, that was not put together in 5 minutes. That probably took somebody several weeks. They would go back, they would look at it, they would refine it, because you're looking at one common thread, and in 250 words, or perhaps a little bit less, you have to write something that is going to engage from the word go. So it's really, really hard to do. My other big issue with flash fiction is for somebody who wants to encapsulate much about their life. A lot of people tend in the first instance to want to write factually, and that really is the kiss of death, as we both know. Facts are very useful as the backbone, as the skeleton, if you like. But what you need to do is to write the story that goes with the facts. And within that, if you really want your writing to resonate and to continue to be read in the future, it is very nice if your recollections also have a few pearls of wisdom. And you don't spell things out, but in the way that you tell the story, you share some of your life's beliefs, the things which have mattered to you deeply. Yeah, don't get me wrong, I love flash fiction.
Yeah, and again, also now flash micro, or micro memoir, as they call it. So, what interests me and what you're saying, there seems to be a lot of crossover here. When you talk about flash fiction, which seems to be in many cases, having read some and having talked to the authors, highly autobiographical anyway. And then you've got what they call micro-memoir, which is supposedly, it is memoir, it is factual, but there's so much space in between, and I guess that's where the stories come alive, those stories you're talking about.
Oh, yes. Well, let's just talk about a French writer, Annie Ernaux.
Oh, yes, beautiful.
Now, she won the Nobel Prize for Literature last year. I suspect most people hadn't heard about Annie until that particular moment in time, and I'll put my hand
Which is a pity, because she's fabulous.
Yeah, but no, this is really interesting. She's written, I believe, around about 8 books, and they are all semi-autobiographical. So they describe an incident in her life. So when she was in her 50s, she had a much younger partner. I think there was a 30-year gap. And she wrote a book called The Young Man. When she was in her 20s, she had an abortion. At a time, because Annie's in her 80s now, at a time when abortions were illegal and you couldn't get them done. And she has used incidents from her life to write very short books. And I was having a conversation with my students last week, and one of them said, yeah, but Annie's books, they're just, how can you regard them as books? They're perhaps 80 or 90 pages in length. And Annie would say, in order to get to that point, in order to produce the quality of writing, it has taken me a very, very long time, because it is actually much easier to churn out copious amounts of texts, as you and I will both know, but to refine it down so you get to the essence of the story. Now that's the skill. And I admire people who can do that.
Well, it's that famous quote, I think it's Blaise Pascal, that said, I would have written a shorter letter if I'd had the time. And encapsulates it beautifully. But I think they're calling that autofiction nowadays, aren't they? It's a relatively new term as opposed to autobiography. Autofiction, which when I first heard it, I thought, oh, it's fiction that writes itself. But of course it's not. It's what you're saying. It's semi-autobiographical fiction. Yes.
Yeah, and I think many writers, one part of it almost goes to far as say that pretty much all writers, whether they're fiction writers or narrative non-fiction, whatever you want to call them, everybody will put something of themselves into their writing.
Well, it's a matter of degree.
Yeah.
Really.
Yeah.
Because there is, as you say, always an autobiographical element in there.
Yes. Yeah.
So I was going to ask you, very importantly too, if people are interested in either working with you or looking at other options, there are organisations of which you can name one at least. So just please help us out here.
Oh, yes, absolutely. So I was delighted a few years ago to find an organisation which is the professional body for life story writers and editors and videographers.
Right.
And it's called Life Stories Australia. It's a not-for-profit. And in every state in Australia, we have members. There are 2 of us here in WA, myself and another gentleman called Matthew Cannon, who's a videographer. Most of the life writers and editors and videographers, most of them are in the eastern states. But again, that should be no reason why you can't, if you're based here in WA, no reason why you can't use their services. They're a great organisation. There are lots of resources which they publish for free on the website.
Oh, website? What is the website address?
Well, it is Life Stories Australia.
.com.
Yeah, just I think it might be lsa.com.
Sure, beautiful.
But just type that in. Just type into Google Life Stories
Yes, of
Australia,
course, just Google it, yes.
And you'll find that. So, yes. Yeah.
So people can obviously get in touch with you through that. And then you, as we were saying before, you're either looking at teaching them how to write themselves or assisting them with writing their story for them.
And one of the things, Will, which I've decided to do, it's taken me quite a long time, but I realise that the reach that I have here in Perth when I'm teaching is very limited. You know, and my class sizes are constricted. I can't have big groups if I really want to do meaningful work. So one of the things that I'm doing next year is I'm starting an online life writing courses. And we're calling ourselves the Life Writing Academy. So I don't wish to plug that too much. But there is an interesting story behind that one. Could I share it with you?
Absolutely, please do.
So 51 years ago, when I was a student, I was 18 years old, at Cardiff University. And my best friend was a girl called Lindsay. And Lindsay and we were pretty inseparable for the 3 years we were at university. And our paths went very, very different ways in life. Lindsay, unlike me, she studied writing, and she is a phenomenal writer, although she would not like people to say that because she's very modest, but she really is. I studied law and sociology when I should have studied writing or history because those were where my interests lay. But anyway, we went our separate ways. And when Lindsay had her 50th birthday, which was nearly 20 years ago now, she tracked me down again, we got in touch, and we resumed our friendship. And to this day, we are still really good friends.
That's fantastic.
Once a week, we have a chat on Zoom. She now lives in Florida. And she works, would you believe, for America's top astrologist.
Oh, okay.
A woman called,
That's interesting.
That's very interesting. We have quite a few talks about astrology. Whether you believe in it or not doesn't really matter, but nevertheless, it is based on some philosophical principles.
And it has a very, very long tradition, of course.
Very long tradition. So we talk about that a little bit. But more to the point, we've been saying for years and years, we should do something that capitalises on the fact that we're both writers. Lynn has also taught life story writing. We really should. And we came up with this idea, let's do it. And so that's what we're going to do. We're launching early part of next year.
Well, that is exciting. So again, people will just have to be patient and just
Yes.
Google, keep it in mind.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's fantastic. Now, to finish with, you did bring some examples in, and although people can't see them, maybe you could just talk a little bit about this is good because this will give us some concrete examples of the kind of work you've been doing with people.
Yeah, so I brought in a couple of books to show, and I'm going to give a plug here. I hope again you don't mind.
Of course.
I'm going to give a plug to a brilliant printing company here in Perth, and they're called iPrint Plus. They're a small family company.
Yes.
The quality of the work that they do is phenomenal. And for people who are writing a life story and perhaps would like to get the book professionally printed and professionally laid out, they will do all of this as a very reasonable package. So they are wonderful.
It's really good to know.
I cannot recommend them highly enough. Anyway, there we go. So I brought a couple of books in to show you. They're very, very different. One is a book, and perhaps can I just backpedal a little bit here? So what I wanted to say, is that I work in a slightly different way to a lot of people. I do not turn up with a list of questions and we'll start with when you were born and end up at the present day point in time. What I actually want to do is to find out the period in your life which really matters to you, and which is the one, if I were to say to you, you can go back in time to this one period, when would it be? And the first book that I've brought in to show you is the story of a Dutch master mariner who lives here in Perth. And when we met, he came up to me and he said, I want my kids and my grandkids to know about a part of my life that I never discuss. When I was 4 years old, my family lived in Surabaya on the island of Java, and the Japanese invaded. I didn't see my father for the next 3 years, and my mother, who was pregnant at the time with 3 children, was taken away and put in various camps, and they got progressively worse and worse and worse over the 3-year incarceration. And my client was, I think, incredibly lucky, A, that he survived, B, that his little baby brother survived. As you can imagine, it was just absolutely dire. And he attributes it all to the remarkable resilience and strength of his mother, who I think, somebody I would love to have met. She was a remarkable woman. So this is the story he wanted to tell, and this is one of the books I brought in. And again, if you think about it, what he would remember, because he's in his middle 80s now, going back that length of time, the memories would not be that many. And his older sisters, they were great. They remembered a lot more, so they were able to help and to give more memories. And then the thing that I usually do when I'm writing for people is I go off and do research. And so I will read contemporary books that people who perhaps were a little bit older than him wrote about similar experiences.
Okay.
So, yeah, that's the first book. We look at his whole life, but really that's the bit that matters.
Yes.
And that's the bit that I focused on, really, to the exclusion of pretty much most other things. The second book that I brought along to show you was quite an interesting one. And it is about a family who live here in Perth today. And my client, again a lady in her 80s, discovered quite by accident that her father was illegitimate. She was completely unaware of this fact, and on his death, she never questioned him about it. On his death, she decided to do some investigation. And she spent nearly 10 years looking, finding, researching, and the story that she came up with was incredible. It truly, truly was. Her father, who had come out, well, she knew about his life. He had been one of the early settlers going down south in the 1920s, attracted by all these wonderful notions of the land and milk and honey and limitless opportunity. You get there, it's a bog swamp. Here's your sickle and axe, get going, chop it all down, and it was absolutely appalling. But what he hadn't realised was that his father was described as the most eminent scholar in the Southern Hemisphere.
Wow.
A man who was beyond remarkable, that is all I'm going to say.
Okay.
And the story in the book really revolves around her grandfather and her grandmother, who she never knew. And the grandmother didn't have an illustrious life. Her grandmother was a domestic servant, and the only facts that were found out, that my client found out, she had 4 census records and a postcard that had been written by her grandfather to her grandmother. And that was it. And again, you can perhaps appreciate, as a writer yourself, that's not a lot to go on when you want to create a picture of a human being that I didn't just want to anyway talk about the illustrious grandfather. I also wanted to bring to life the grandmother.
Exactly, yes.
And that's the joy for me when I'm allowed to have a little bit of free reign and go back and imagine what was it like in the 1840s and, growing up in a very isolated part of Scotland where women were not traditionally educated, apart from, well, we'll teach them how to look after children, do a little bit of planting in the garden and basically look after the house. That was it. There were no expectations. The expectations were all on men at that time. So as a feisty woman, which I think her grandmother was, how do you cope with that?
Yes.
Because you've got nothing to elevate yourself out of the life you've been born into. And do we say that people are invisible? Or do we understand that they had a life? And within the constraints, you have no education, you are not born into societies, you have no family, you have no inheritance, you have nothing, and maybe you weren't that beautiful. Perhaps beauty could elevate a woman from very humble origins, the sort of Liza Doolittle story, into another world. But the grandmother had none of those, and I think, given what she had, she was remarkable. And yeah, I'm very proud of that
sounds
book,
like a beautiful story.
because not so much what I did, but the research that my client did.
Yes.
She was and she is the star of that story. So well done to her. And her children today, all affluent. Her grandchildren, they're well educated. They all have prosperous jobs, but they came from that illegitimate little boy who didn't know his backstory. Wow.
Okay, no, look, that's beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. And we should emphasise, of course, these books, and they're beautifully printed and produced, by the way, are essentially for the families. They're not something you're going to see on a bookshelf anywhere, and that's not what this is about. Just to go back to where we kind of started, why we ought to do this, how important all our lives are as individuals and how to tell them. It's in the telling.
Totally.
So, look, unfortunately, we're out of time here on Pod Street. Thank you so much for your time, Rhuwina. It's been a pleasure talking to you, and I'm really hoping that people who have been listening have been inspired to think about their own lives, their own life stories, and perhaps get in touch, or even if not, just go and sit down and start writing.
Yes. Thank you so much, Will. It's been a real pleasure to have this conversation with you. Thank you indeed.